Hello and welcome back to the madness. I'm your guide Aaron, and today we're taking a short hike through the darkness to talk about The Time Traveler's Wife. I read this book in November of 2025, and I keep thinking back to the really strange natal politics of the book, so let's talk about that. I'm using the term natal politics to refer to the conversation of birth in the greater culture of the United States, which is where the book takes place. Natal politics would cover everything from birth rates to contraception to purity culture. I know some people needle over the usage of the word politics outside the scope of governmental politics, but one of the accepted definitions of the term is the total complex relations between people living in a society. So basically, correct usage of the term politics. Plus, I personally believe that if someone tries to make a law about a topic, regardless if that law is passed, that topic then becomes political, whether it wanted to or not. So when I say we're discussing the natal politics of The Time Traveler's Wife, what I mean is that we're discussing the way the book talks about birth. I'm not making any claims that this is what the author, Audrey Neffenagar, believes, because I didn't ask her, and you can't psychoanalyze someone you didn't talk to. So The Time Traveler's Wife is a sci-fi romance novel about a man who's chronically displaced, meaning that he blips in and out of time without much control over when and where this happens, and it's also about the woman he ends up marrying. The novel structure is an asynchronous timeline of the various meeting points of Claire and Henry. We're basically being told this story out of order. The tone shifts at the midpoint of the novel. The first half is really about how Claire and Henry meet and get married, and how Henry deals with being a time traveler, which is not a fun thing in this novel. Henry teleports when he's stressed to random locations in the past and very seldom the future, and he teleports without clothes. And it's not like the world is aware of time traveling yet, so Henry has to learn how to pick locks and lie his way out of the worst situations imaginable, so he can find clothes and figure out where he is. And at the midpoint, Henry and Claire are together, and the latter half of the novel is effectively an infertility narrative. Claire and Henry want to have a child, but they struggle to have one. The first thing I want to talk about is arguably the most disturbing. Honestly, it's all pretty strange, but I think this is the worst of it. So Claire and Henry get pregnant, but Claire miscarriages at least 2 times. There is, unfortunately, a lot of miscarriage in this story. The book does a really good job at handling this. It is a really tragic point in their marriage as they struggle to have a baby. It's raw and emotional. However, one day Henry decides, enough. He's already been on the fence about having a child because he worries about them also being a time traveler, which, as we've discussed, is not exactly a cool ability to have, but he loves Claire, and this is something she really wants, and so he's a willing participant. But after so many miscarriages, he simply cannot put Claire through another and withdraws consent to make a child. Claire isn't happy about this, and ultimately Henry decides to get a vasectomy. They find out they're pregnant once more directly after this vasectomy, meaning Claire was pregnant right before the procedure, and they lose that baby too. You would think that's the end of it, but oh boy, you'd be wrong. Basically, a time-traveling Henry, presumably a Henry of the past, since he's capable of getting Claire pregnant, but it could be a future Henry who had his vasectomy reversed. A time-traveling Henry teleports to the present day and has sex with Claire, and she becomes pregnant and manages to successfully give birth. Let's break down why this is a fucked up thing to do. I don't care where or when time-traveling Henry has been, it's still not Henry of the present day. These are philosophical questions we don't ask because these are impossible situations. If a version of you from the past shows up to accomplish a goal that you do not want to accomplish, have you consented to accomplishing that goal? I would think not, because the time traveler gets to leave and not worry about the consequences of accomplishing that goal, where you in the present must deal with those consequences. Now, typically the phrase "my body, my choice" is often used to affirm a woman's decision to conceive a child because it is her body that produces the baby. The ideology does also include men, because just as much as a woman has the right to choose if she has a child or not, a man has a right to choose if he helps conceive a child. The act of conception includes his body, and it's his choice as to whether he wants to participate. Henry of the present day has so clearly withdrawn consent, on conceiving a child, and I think it's really fucked up that a time-traveling version of him shows up to violate the withdrawal of consent. I don't care that it's technically the same guy. Henry of the present day's specific decision is because he can't in his right mind put Claire through another pregnancy. He fears for her life. And of course it ends up working out, because this is a novel, and the story gets to go the way that the author wants. That doesn't make it any less deranged. The most disturbing part of this narrative is how quickly this is forgotten. I find this scene extremely violating, but it's framed as a necessity to the end goal, working on the assumption that all married couples should want children, and any opposition is merely an obstacle to overcome. So, a trope that persists in media is how the end of a female's character's storyline is motherhood. The story has ended and the epilogue shows the female character with a baby. There's nothing inherently wrong with ending a narrative with motherhood. The issue that arises is when there's no data in the novel that suggests this is a desire of the female main character. What does it say about our society that when we think of concluding a female storyline out, the end game is motherhood? We don't have to write it in the story that she wants to be a mother. It's just something that we assume because we assume that every woman's end goal is to be a mom. We're about to spoil the Hunger Games. The most famous example that I can think of is the Hunger Games. And while I do understand that there are a lot of great interpretations that make Katniss's ending of motherhood work, I personally just don't like it. Motherhood never felt like something integral to Katniss's character, and I felt like it was an easy way out because we killed Prim and her mom leaves her alone, and Katniss's whole character was built around protecting her family. And since all of that was lost, the only way to bring us back into that theme is to give her a new family. And I just feel cheated out of any meaningful catharsis. The problem, regardless if you liked this ending or not, is that Katniss never expresses wanting to be a mom in the trilogy. In fact, she states that she never wanted to have kids. Claire as a mother makes sense in The Time Traveler's Wife. It is properly seeded that this is a desire, and we spend the second half of the novel on this infertility narrative. It's not something that we duct taped to the end and wrote the word epilogue over the top. But I don't bring this trope up to talk about Claire. I think it better fits Henry because he's so adamantly against children and is just worn down by Claire and fate to bitterly allow this child to be conceived, and he doesn't divorce her over this. I think that if a couple truly cannot get on the same page as to have kids or not have kids, the ethical thing to do is divorce. Each half of the couple should be able to pursue their desires, and I would rather see them separated and fulfilled than watch one of them have to give in to the other. So if Claire is so determined to have a baby, perhaps she should divorce Henry and find someone who actually wants a child. Welcome to the second disturbing piece of natal politics of this book. Claire doesn't want any baby. She wants specifically Henry's baby and only his baby. Adoption is off the table. But I want to talk about that for a moment. Why does America have such mixed feelings about adoption? Why does it seem so normal for Claire to be so against it? According to the National Council for Adoption, about 90% of women in the 2010s experienced some level of stigma about their decision to place their child for adoption, which is up from 70% in the 1970s. This means that friends, family, healthcare providers, and more make pregnant women feel bad for wanting to put their child up for adoption and sometimes try to convince her that she has to not adopt and care for it herself. Another problem that women have with making adoption plans is actually, according to AIE.org, a lack of investment in the concept of adoption on two separate fronts. Essentially, women are pressured into only two options: have the child and raise it yourself, or quit the pregnancy entirely. Neither side is actually invested in putting the child up for adoption, which I find absolutely fascinating because we know that a really common argument for forced birth ideology is that you can just put it up for adoption. But the reality is, behind the closed doors of family, social workers, and doctors, no one is actually trying to accomplish the goal of adoption. I understand why safe haven laws and baby boxes are either no contact or no questions asked, because it really seems difficult to make adoption plans. The only time I really see adoption framed as a good thing is international adoptions, because there's like this savior complex about it. I mean, look at family vlogging channels and how many clicks their international adoptions get. So that's the stigma on trying to put a baby up for adoption, but what about the actual adoption process? The major fear is that a child will have greater needs than the person can handle, this coming from the Family Studies Institute. Newsflash, all children are high needs because they're all individuals learning how to be a person. There's no such thing as an easy child. There's also this whole culture around progeny and having children that are biologically yours. Ideologies like the nuclear family do have an impact on our society. And the idea that we should get married and have 2 kids of our own creates a situation where other family dynamics are seen as quote unquote unnatural, despite being perfectly normal. This is why IVF is very popular despite being expensive and unreliable. People would rather risk IVF and go bankrupt than just adopt a kid. And this is not even taking into consideration that adoption is expensive, right? We're not even talking about that. You did not come here for a lecture on the adoption culture of the United States, I know. So let's talk about why this is relevant. We can't separate authors from their books because an author's perception of their society impacts their writing in ways that they might not even intend. And by that I mean Claire's anti-adoption ideology is a result of the pre-existing ideologies of adoption at the turn of the millennium in the United States. The author believed this plot point to be believable because of the society she lives in, and we, the audience, even in 2026, can find this plot point believable because the adoption stigma continues to exist and is theorized to be getting worse. So now that we have a broad understanding of the adoption politics in the United States, let's talk about Claire's very strange opinion on adoption. Henry, who we established does not want children and cannot put Claire through another miscarriage, suggests adoption, and Claire acts like this is the end of the world. If you were adopted and you read The Time Traveler's Wife and are willing to share, I'd love to know your thoughts on Claire's little meltdown at the prospect of having to adopt, or just tell me how you feel about these kinds of reactions in storytelling. Because for Claire, it's important she has Henry's baby because she wants a piece of Henry that won't time travel away from her, so when he's gone, there's still a piece of him with her. Go buy an emotional support Stanley Cup like the rest of society. You're talking about a child, not some product. Oh, what? You don't want to adopt for the same reason 13-year-olds don't want an off-brand Stanley because it's just not the same as the real one? Claire wants a child-shaped product to act like a stand-in for her husband. Soldiers' wives were not even doing this during wartime. They waited until after the men got home to start making duplicates of them. How do we know that? The goddamn baby boom happened after the World Wars. After. Soldiers' wives could feel the presence of their husbands with sweetheart jewelry and brooches. Men on the front lines got letters scented with their wives' perfumes. It's almost like wanting to make a child to have something to remember your husband by is really fucked up. The icing on this dollar store cake is that Alba, the daughter that they eventually have, is also a time traveler, but a gifted time traveler who can control where she goes, whatever. Who cares about writing logic? So Claire's desires are not realized. She does not have a piece of Henry that doesn't leave her, and worst of all, Henry dies, and Alba sees him time travel into the future all the time, which is really convenient despite the fact the lore stating future travel is rare, but okay, who cares about book logic? And Claire laments about how she's jealous that Alba and Henry have this whole life together that she's not a part of, and Claire only sees Henry one last time when she's an old woman, so everything she wanted out of a child she does not get. But I'm sitting here asking, what was the point? All of this struggle, this violating of Henry's right of autonomy, all for Claire to get nothing she wanted. Nobody wins, and now there's a child, and it's really fucked up, and all of this could have been avoided if she just adopted a kid. It's also so anti-adoption to think that an adopted child could not be representative of their parents because there's no blood relation. Do you feel the same way about the aunts and uncles who married your parents as siblings? What about a step-parent? Do you feel like your partner's parents are not related to you in any meaningful way? There are so many family members in our family units who are related to us by law and not by blood, and we don't see them as any less familial. And I suppose you could argue that there's some satisfaction of Claire's plan blowing up in her face, but I can't be satisfied knowing that what had to happen to get us here. Even though Alba time travels too, Claire still sees her as a piece of Henry and is still satisfied and feels like her goal was accomplished, even if it didn't exactly work out the way that she wanted it to. Alba is still technically a win for Claire as presented by the novel. Let's move on to the last piece of Natal politics, and for me, this one is personal. I'm about to become a soapbox supervillain, because the thing that sends me up the river about this next topic is the fact that it's not a major plot point, and the story is not hinged upon this narrative existing. It is just here for the love of the game, and this is not a game I think anyone wants to play. So time travel is a genetic thing, and Henry has to convince a geneticist named Dr. Kendrick that he's a time traveler to get him to help. He does this by writing the details of Kendrick's unborn child's birth certificate down on a piece of paper. Wow, that was a mouthful. Information that only a time traveler could know, and one of these details is that the child is born with Down syndrome. This is a detail the parents did not know until after the baby was born. I am arguing that the author didn't do any research into Down syndrome. Someone who has no Down syndrome in their life might not realize how absurd the situation is with a geneticist that doesn't seem to know anything about Down syndrome. 1996, which is the year that this happens, is the year where advocacy groups of doctors were being formed to help spread awareness for Down syndrome, namely the Down Syndrome Medical Interest Group. The history of detecting Down syndrome prior to birth really begins in the 1960s, but the 80s and 90s were like the hotbed for Down syndrome research. Chromosome 22 was the first chromosome to be sequenced in 1999, mostly because it was the smallest of our chromosomes. That makes sense. You need to prove you can do something. You start with what's most manageable. But it's not a coincidence that after we proved we could sequence chromosomes, that 21 was the second one to be sequenced. Yes, it's also small, which helps with the sequencing, but we already knew this chromosome was linked to Down syndrome, and that was a major factor into why 21 was sequenced next. So I suppose I can buy a geneticist getting a false negative on a Down syndrome test, but what I can't buy is that he doesn't seem to know anything about Down syndrome. He's a geneticist. He literally sequences genes. I don't know how much closer to his field of study we can get. Yet he and his wife have to be consoled about the fact that their child was born with Down syndrome. I would think that of all the people, a gene sequencing geneticist would be the most informed and prepared person to raise this child. Henry has to promise Kendrick that their child grows up to be happy and fulfilled despite their Down syndrome, and I don't know why Henry has to reassure him when Kendrick should know that his child's prognosis is actually pretty great. But the worst part, the actual worst part, is that Henry asks if Kendrick had known ahead of time, would Kendrick have quit the pregnancy? And Kendrick says, and this is almost a direct quote. I am paraphrasing, but it's pretty close to the quote. That they're Catholic, so it wouldn't have mattered anyways. That doesn't sound like someone who actually values human life. It sounds like if Kendrick hadn't had that pesky Catholicism in the way, he might have quit the pregnancy. That he is forced to have this child no matter when they knew about the child's diagnosis. How do you think someone with Down syndrome would react to reading this? This is how you want to represent their parents? I understand that there's a spectrum of reaction to news like this, but this is not a Down syndrome story. This isn't even necessary for the plot to function. Is this really the time for a deeply complicated and morally bankrupt reaction to having a child with Down syndrome? In The Memory Keeper's Daughter, the negative reaction of the father to his daughter with Down syndrome makes sense because the whole story is centered on how his negative reaction and the way he dealt with it was one of the worst things he's ever done, and he's not seen as a good person for it. We get to spend a whole book exploring the consequences to parents not wanting children with Down syndrome and parents that do in all its complexities. The Time Traveler's Wife, we get 2 scenes about it, and the child never comes up again. That is not enough time to thoughtfully engage with this topic. According to the National Library of Medicine, 1/3 of children with Down syndrome admitted to the NICU don't have any major abnormalities, and it seems like Kendrick's child is either one of these children, or even better, a child that didn't need to go into the NICU at all. Kendrick is very casual about the way he talks about his child, and I would think that if this child needed immediate medical interventions, it would have been brought up. If the author had done any research into disability and what a bad prognosis looks like, it would have been far more believable to portray Kendrick and his wife as distraught, because what parent wouldn't be distraught at the thought of their child being admitted to NICU. It's just basic empathy to not want your child to suffer, and it's really easy to blame Down syndrome in the shock of seeing your baby struggle. But we don't have any of that in the story. As far as we're aware, this child got to go home with the mother, which is amazing. According to Henry, this kid gets to lead a fairly stable life. That's wonderful. I think I'm angry about this because Kendrick and his wife seem so ungrateful that their child wasn't born dying, that he seems so annoyed that his religion would have forced him to have this child anyways. Like, they don't seem to want to have this kid, but are forced to have it anyways. I think it ended up being written this way because the author didn't research Down syndrome and used it as a narrative shortcut for the worst possible news a parent could hear. And I know from experience that a child with Down syndrome that has a bad prognosis can be the worst thing a parent can hear. But with what little data we have, this child seems to have a really good prognosis. And so the narrative shortcut simply doesn't work. And it relies on the assumption that the reader doesn't know anything about Down syndrome and assumes that Down syndrome equals terrible quality of life, which simply isn't true. I can't get behind these parents who clearly don't want this kid. That's what I got from reading this. And I think as someone with Down syndrome in my life, the scene where Henry has to convince Kendrick it'll be alright and the kid is a good kid, that is like horror for me. I am so incredibly haunted by it. So, what do we think about the strange natal politics of the time traveler's wife? We have this idea that personal autonomy is secondary to the desire of having a child, and it's assumed that having children is fulfilling an ultimate goal in life. We have the objectification of blood-born children to act as totems for their absent parents, anti-adoption sentiments because an adopted child allegedly can't fulfill the wants and desires of a blood-born child, that without the blood connection, the child can't effectively be a fully realized member of the household and serve as a point of unity between the two parents. And then we have parents begrudgingly accepting a disabled child into their life not because they see them as a child first that deserves to live as stable a life as humanly possible, but because the parents belong to a religion that would have forced them to have a child no matter what, so they better get used to it. This book is absolutely a product of its time, and I'm not really here to say these parts of the book shouldn't have existed or that it's even inaccurate. Even at my most critical, my problem with the Down syndrome plotline, the problem is there's just not enough time to fully explore that narrative. Really, at the end of the day, I just wanted to point a finger at this book and say, I mean, it's just a little fucked up when you think about it, right? The madness has ended, and you can go in peace.